All right, welcome to the USS Tennessee Battleship and World War II Remembrance Museum in Huntsville, Tennessee.
What's your hours of operation?
Okay, well, my name's Jeff Swanson. I'm the director and curator of the museum. The museum is currently open 2 Saturdays a month. If you go on the Museum of Scott County website, that lists the dates that we are open. I will also open the museum for special groups or by appointment. So if there are groups of folks, veterans, family members that would like to come visit the museum, we'll also open the museum up for special events. This is the bell from the USS Tennessee, the original bell that was on the ship when she was commissioned. It came to Huntsville, Tennessee with the aid of the late Senator Howard Baker, who was instrumental in getting the museum located here in Huntsville. And as you can see, this is a stone that was dedicated in memory to all the soldiers or the sailors and Marines who had died on Tennessee between Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, and the end of the war, in 45. Yeah, I don't know if those guys were pilots that died on one of the, something afterwards, but
And one went inside?
sure.
And the one guy didn't have a date.
Museum, was saying the museum moved to Tennessee in 2005. The original curator, Paul Dawson, started the museum in Ohio. His father was the photographer on the ship in 1944 and 45 towards the end of the war. He worked closely with the Reunion Association that was active at the time from the ship. And as the sailors and Marines reached a point where they were passing or they wanted to donate the items that they had collected from their service, they donated those to Paul and hence the museum. We have a large collection of items here that are very personal and donated mostly from the men who served on board the ship. We also have items like this flag, which was the last flag that flew on the ship and it was taken down in 1947 and presented to the Reunion Association. And that made its way to the museum as well. But as you can see, we have uniforms, we have personal items. This Pelorus and the binnacle were removed from the Tennessee when it was scrapped and made their way to a naval base in Millington, Tennessee, and hence when the museum moved to Oneida, or to Huntsville rather, we got those things from Millington and got them installed. So as we've been upgrading and doing things with the museum, we've been making it more interactive for kids. We have an operating light box for the signal lamp that was here. And we also have a 14-inch shell that was delivered to my house today that will ultimately, next time the museum's open, we'll have a full-size model of this shell, which is what was fired from the main guns on the battleship. So you can see we have displays about the gun turrets and how they worked and the various ordnance that the ship had over the course of its life. It varied from 50 caliber machine guns for anti-aircraft and up to the 40 millimeter Bofors and 20 millimeter for anti-aircraft, 3-inch shells and 5-inch shells that were fired from the ship. A lot of what we like to portray is life as the sailors saw it and the things that they did. So one section of the museum is dedicated to how the sailors entertained themselves. Back to the pre-war period of time, 20s and 30s, and this was a Navy tradition. All the ships had various sports teams for basketball, football, boxing, wrestling, crew, softball. They kept those 18 and 19-year-old sailors and Marines occupied and busy, but this kind of shows the various activities of the ship's force. We have something that explains the big tradition with crossing the equator. This certificate is something that was issued to everybody who crossed the equator for the first time. You went from a polywog to a shellback, and a lot of the things we have donated are the certificates that the sailors held very, very dearly to their hearts because it was a major event for them to do that. But you can see the variety of sports over the years and the things that the Tennessee accomplished through their sports team. The ship had its own band. The band would play at organized events such as ship-sponsored dances, but when there was hard work to be done, such as loading 14-inch shells into the magazines on the turrets, the band would come out and they'd pipe up and play some music while their guys were out there working. Wow. Religious services were a very big part of ship life, and every Sunday at 10 o'clock, whether you were at sea or in port, there would be religious services held by various denominations on the ship. But the ship spent most of its life in pre-war period from between 1920 up to 1941. The Tennessee was a dreadnought-style battleship that was designed and built at the end of World War I. It was approved by Congress in 1915, but it wasn't commissioned until 1920, so it never made it into World War I. Due to a number of treaties that existed after World War I, the United States, as well as other naval navies in the world, were limited with modernization and how many tons of battleships you could have. So when the Japanese attacked America at Pearl Harbor, the battleships that were in the fleet at the time were all these old World War I holdover ships that we just kept extending their life while we were trying to build up a more modern Navy. Of course, that accelerated after the attack on Pearl Harbor. But as you move into this section of the museum, we start getting into the war years, and you can see, as we've been remodeling here, we still have some paint stuff to do, obviously, but these were the ships, the 8 battleships that were at Pearl Harbor that we're probably all familiar with, and you can see they're all the old vintage fighting tops with the towers, battleships that were at Pearl Harbor on that day. Some of the pieces that we have here are really give visitors a chance to directly connect with Pearl Harbor and what happened that day. This porthole cover was on the ship at Pearl Harbor. This is a new model that we added. This is what the ship looked like on December the 7th, 1941. And you can see along the side of the hull all these openings, which were the portholes. Well, after the attack, as the Navy was preparing the ship to go back to the West Coast, to Puget Sound, they took all the porthole covers off and any damaged material and threw it into trash heaps on Ford Island and labeled it per ship. This was in the Tennessee heap, and some salvage workers grabbed this porthole cover and shipped it back to the States. Ultimately made its way to the Reunion Association, but this porthole cover was at Pearl Harbor on the Tennessee on December the 7th. I think one of the most important pieces that we have that really tells a story is this star. This star was on the flag of the USS West Virginia the day of December 7th. You can see this picture here, which is a famous picture of the West Virginia, the Tennessee, and the Arizona. Most people are familiar with what happened to the Arizona. If you look at this picture, you can see Battleship Row. That ship's the California. You have Oklahoma, Maryland, West Virginia, Tennessee, and the Arizona and Nevada. So you can see the Tennessee is inboard of all those ships. She's only 75 feet ahead of the Arizona, once they were tied up to these concrete mooring ties there. But This was after the attack. You can see the hose station here. Damage control has hose stations on the stern. All the oil that was released from these ships caught fire when they were ruptured, and that water moved past the Tennessee, causing a lot of damage. Tennessee itself was hit by 2 bombs on the number 2 and number 3 turret, and she lost 5 sailors. But in comparison to the other ships in Pearl Harbor, she sustained minimal damage. When the West Virginia sank, that forced the Tennessee against the concrete ways, and she could not make way. But what she could do is operate her propellers to move water and try and keep as much of that flaming water away from the ship. She sustained a lot of damage internal just from the heat radiating in, damaging electrical cables and causing internal fires in the ship itself. But when the ship got to a point that it was controlling damage and she could send sailors from the Tennessee to the other ships to help out, she did. And one of the sailors was Bob Bishop. Bob Bishop went to the West Virginia to help, and when he got onto the West Virginia, he found that star laying on the deck of the West Virginia. That star was flying on the flag of the West Virginia at the time of the attack, and that was all that was left of the flag. It's a very important piece of history because of the tie. But we have things like this that have what particular sailors were doing that day, and this gentleman was on shore leave. Had he been on the ship at the time of the attack, had he not been on leave, he would have been on his station, would have been killed in the attack, and a lot of things like that make this more personal for people that come here to the museum. This is a piece of shrapnel from the bomb hit on the Tennessee, and we also have some pieces from the USS Arizona here. You can see on this ship model here, and I got this model so people could really see 3-dimensionally what the ships look like at the time. But if you take now that picture of that ship and notice the minimal guns on it, on the ship, and you go to eventually what the ship looked like after modernization, you can hardly see the likeness in both ships. It's a complete transformation. But what's most obvious is the addition of modern radar, fire control systems, and also the 40 millimeter, 20 millimeter, and dual purpose 5-inch guns that are there specifically for protection of anti-aircraft protection. She went in for this major modernization in September of 42, came out in May of 43. And, another interesting story about that period in our history is how we were able to take a ship in that configuration and in 8 months produce a modernized battleship to get it back out into the war. So, and this panel here is one that we just did that tells that whole story from Pearl Harbor through the modernization and ultimately when the ship got back out into the war and up to Kiska and Attu in the Alaskan territory to kick the Japanese back out of American territory. They had landed in Alaskan territory, and a lot of Americans don't realize that we had Japanese on American soil, but we did. The museum moves from there into some specifics about individual battles that the Tennessee was in. So Tennessee was an older battleship, and while they could modernize the ordnance and the radar and some of the electronics on it, what they couldn't do is make the ship go faster. So these older battleships couldn't keep up with the carrier task forces. The new battleships that came out were fast battleships in design. They could keep up with the task forces. But what these old battleships could do with their large guns is provide fire support and support landings on Tarawa and Iwitak, which is what they did. So they provided shore bombardment and fire support once we got onto those islands. And Tennessee went through most of the major island hopping operations in the Pacific War. So Tarawa and Iwitak, Kwajalein, Guam, Tinian Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, Palau, Okinawa. She had quite a history in the war. Once again, we had a lot of personal things that have been donated that we're in the process of doing historical interpretation so visitors can better understand what it is that they're looking at. But it's quite a collection of items that have been donated by the various sailors and Marines who served on it. The Tennessee, as did all battleships, had a contingent on it that was not an organic part of the ship's force, an aviation branch that flew spotter planes that you may have seen on the model back there, the various planes on them. Those planes provided two purposes. These guns could fire over 20 miles, so out of eye shot. And so the spotter aircraft were used to help dial in those shells and that firing. But closer in on, say, the island invasions, they were also used to really help pinpoint distances on specific targets that they had to hit, pillboxes, enemy emplacements, that type of stuff. So they were a vital part of the whole system for the ship. And you also had a group, a Marine detachment on board the ship that was there for security, but the Marines also had specific gun emplacements, 5-inch guns, 40 millimeter, 20, that they would man as a unit as well. So there was approximately 80 Marines on board the Tennessee in addition to the ship's force. One thing I will say, when the ship changed from its configuration, World War I configuration, to World War II, the crew size was about 1,100 at Pearl Harbor. When that ship hit the waves, the crew size more than doubled, up to 2,300 sailors and officers. And it's kind of obvious why. They added so many more guns and so much more electronics that they needed the crew space. But when we're back in the earlier part, you saw the hammock that was hanging up in the air. When the Tennessee was in that configuration, the divisions had division areas on board the ship. So your division, whether it was a gun, one main gun division, whatever, electricians, machinist mates, would have an area that's your divisional area. You would sleep in that area. You would eat in that area. If you wanted to relax in that, you'd go to your division area. They were issued cots or hammocks, or possibly cots, depending where you're at in the ship. And after the upgrades, all the cots, all that stuff went away to where they had bunks, metal bunks, stacked bunks, and like you're familiar with now, so they could get more sailors into those spaces. The interior spaces didn't really change the volume, so you had to find a way to more than double your capacity for putting those people. And they also did away with the individual mess areas. It now became more of a cafeteria style mess for the sailors and Marines. So in the old days, you'd send the messmen off, your division messmen would go off and bring food back to your division area. After modernization, you would rotate through one of these cafeteria. This is dedicated to Lee Dawson, who is Paul Dawson's father. I mentioned the founder of the museum. He was a photographer, and he donated all his equipment to Paul, who then incorporated there. And we also have another cabinet that's donated to a gentleman named Hamp Law, who operated in one of the main turrets on the ship. But back in the day, people did a lot of cartoons. They liked to draw. Ham took it one step further after the war and became a professional cartoonist. But he's donated a lot of his cartoons to the museum. And so we've got those on display. As you go around the museum, you'll see various cartoons on the wall. Those are all Hamp's cartoons that we decided to put up as appropriate. And then you finally get into this part of the museum, which is the end of the war for the ship and her travels back to the States, which after modernization, she was too wide to go through the Panama Canal. So to get back to Philadelphia at the end of the war, she had to go around South Africa and then up the Atlantic to Philadelphia at that point. So various collections. One thing we have too is this very detailed model that was made by the museum historian at the time, Clifton Simmons. He's a professional model maker, obviously. This is the ship in 1945. You can see through the details just how complex these ships were at the time. If you look real close, though, between the two houses, you'll see a little brass bell above the binnacle in there. That's where the ship bell ended up on the modern version of the ship. So we wanted to make the tie from out front of the museum all the way through the picture that's at the entrance to the museum, ultimately through both models in here. We did get a piece of teak deck from the Navy at the end of the war. Well, when they were scrapping the ship, the Navy requested certain things be transferred from the ship to their archives at the Washington Naval Yard. And they let us have a piece of the teak deck. But that's a big overview of the museum. There's hundreds more items to talk through and see. But
What's the story on that?
Great question. So when a ship is commissioned, you get a commissioning banner. And that's the original banner that was with the Tennessee. That stayed with the ship its entire life. And then when she was decommissioned, the ship donated that to the Reunion Association with that flag, the flag that's hanging, and they made their way to the museum. So this was at commissioning, and that was at the last flag to come down off the ship, retire. So, and this is a small display for the Marine contingents that we're on, that we want to expand that a little bit more. But we had one gentleman put together a display of the Marines who made the ultimate sacrifice. And this was primarily during the kamikaze attack that the ship experienced at Okinawa. And it hit a Marine gun emplacement that they were manning. The latest ship to have the name Tennessee, and it's still in service, is the USS Tennessee. Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine, commissioned in 1988, and late Senator Howard Baker was one of the keynote principal speakers at that commissioning.
Very, very interesting.
So we have just literally hundreds of items and documents that most organizations and people don't know that this museum's here. It's the largest collection of items from the USS Tennessee in the world. We have been in communication with the Tennessee State Military Museum. I've taken them on a virtual tour. The Tennessee State historian was through here 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
So we've elevated it to the state level, and he feels that this museum merits state support, possibly national support.
Awesome.
And certainly we feel it does. East Tennessee Historical Society is coming up. MTSU has been here. I've spoken to the East Tennessee Military Affairs Commission in Knoxville about the museum. So, one of my principal missions is to raise the visibility and the value for this museum beyond Scott County, so that all Tennesseans see this as a resource. Well, hope it will. We have a Facebook page with contact information. If you go to USS Tennessee BB-43 World War II Remembrance Museum, that's the Facebook page number. You'll see regular updates on there. I also have the days that the museum's open.
Okay.
And for special groups, veterans, family members of Tennessee vets, I will open the museum up by appointment.
Right. We appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much for spending time coming out to see us.
Great. Come out and check it out.